had some gaps, as it were, suddenly appear. So I've been able to dive straight into it and just sort a few things out. And the big job today was the formatting. So
yeah, well done.
Yeah, mighty work.
You guys need to read it though.
We're actually live now, so I'll just say hello, everybody. My name is John from Broadsheet, and you're very welcome to the 13th in a series of shows looking at the Mother and Baby Home Commission of Investigation report. Delighted to be joined by Tuam campaigner Breda Murphy, adoptee and activist Union Duffy, and Frank Breheny, a son of a Tuam adoptee. Good evening, Breda, Union, and Frank.
Hi. Evening, John. Evening, everybody.
Hi, everybody.
Breda, I'm going to go to you first because it's been a very busy week in terms of aspects around the report. But you wanted to talk about the burials report, or the burials bill, which is going through now, and in particular, well, you kick it off there, Breda.
It was always relevant, John, but it's even more relevant now, but because of what's happening in Bessborough. And Maureen, one of our first shows was with Maureen Considine of the Cork Survivors Group, and she'd explained the maths and the applications for planning permission. Now a decision will be given this week. So various people have spoken out, including ICCL and a forensic archaeologist who is Farah O'Donovan, I think is how you pronounce his name.
Yeah.
And it's about the protection of sites, really. And I think it's so important because all sites where children and mothers were kept and that were run by religious orders, it is highly likely that they have burial grounds unmarked. And if you remember, the remains of Brendan Kerrigan were found in Letterfrack. He was only 4 years of age when he disappeared, or when he was in the Letterfrack home in 1935. And a man in his 70s came to the memorial organised by the Joseph Pike Foundation in 2002. And he brought those people who had gathered there to a site where he believed a little child was buried. And throughout his life, he had carried that memory, and he wanted to do right by the boy. So again, for Joseph Pike, he died in St. Joseph's, and that was much later. It's in the 1950s. But again, it's about the fact that remains of children, marked or unmarked, maybe in these sites, and they are now being looked at by developers at times. So we need to have, as the forensic archaeologist said, a national monuments declared on these sites, so that then there's a protective order there. And when it comes to looking at them, or when it comes to selling from the religious order's point of view, there's certain aspects that need to be investigated.
And it's the Institutional Burials Bill. It disapplies the Coroner's Act. Inquest to establish cause of death may not be carried out in violation of survivors' right to truth about what happened to their loved ones. That especially applies immediately to the Tuam situation, doesn't it, Breda?
Absolutely. And we actually gave 2 submissions to the committee, the Oireachtas Committee, and they will be hearing submissions next month. Now, one of them has a strong human rights flavour, and the other looks from a DNA perspective as to the technologies that are applicable. But both submissions, we were really conscious that the one thing we needed to ensure was that either the coroner or a team of coroners, I mean, there are 796 children, so one would think that this is too much work for one person. So they should have a proper forensic team involved. And Ewan knows lots about this as well, because it's applicable to a site in Donegal that he has talked about.
Ewan?
Yeah, well, the Canada Truth Commission, for example, that happened a number of years ago, actually, that looked into the Indigenous residential children there. One of the many aspects that came out of that was the issues around the protected status for any burial grounds that are known. Obviously, Bessborough and Cork has so many anomalies around it, and they're being denied by government. The whole issues around development and redevelopment, obviously, are extremely pertinent. And these, I suppose, this comes back to the fact that the burden is always on the victims and survivors to make sure that they fight tooth and nail around everything. So I suppose what Dr. O'Donovan was talking about was that there needs to be some kind of a national monument in terms of a protective status, as Breda has said already, to ensure that victims and survivors don't have to keep a constant watch on what's going on up and down the length and breadth of Ireland, that the government actually are proactive and preempt any potential planning developments on the sites, former sites and existing sites, remember, because that's something we need to be very careful about here, that it's not just the sites of the former institutional settings here. There are obviously a lot of enterprises still ongoing, some of which are still under the auspices of actually some of the religious orders that were involved. And what we're talking about here is the fact that, many things are pointing towards including the Burial Act, that it might actually be a case of where there's any residential dwellings or commercial dwellings ongoing at the minute, that these sites cannot be touched. And obviously, we would argue that that should definitely not be the case. That's completely inappropriate.
How many sites are there, Ewan?
Sorry? Many
sites are there, do you reckon?
John, every former institution is a potential site. So I just got wind very, very late last week about redevelopment up in Fawn in Donegal, where there was a Sisters of Nazareth children's home established there from the 1940s. And, the academic report in the north and the Residential Redress Act made reference to this former children's home because it was virtually a holding centre, a holding pen for an awful lot of children moved from institutions in the south and in particular the north, where we know many illegal and forced adoptions took place. And of course, subsequent to that, the children were moved onto an international trafficking basis to many different countries. So I immediately submitted a planning objection to at least insert an archaeological geophysical caveat for before any development would take place on that site. Now, nobody has identified the fact that there's a burial ground on the grounds, but this is the whole point. We're talking about the systemic nature of the way these burial malpractices were carried out up and down the length and breadth of Ireland. Bessborough, Tuam, Ross Cray, Hyde Park and Dublin are all really, really significant symbolic instances of where these malpractices are carried out, John. So the legislation has to apply to every county. That's why we're basically asking the government to now, instead of the victims and survivors being the watchers, we need the government to be proactive and instigate to let every council know that if there's any future development planning at all that comes to light, then they have to be alert to that. And they have to make sure that there's an archaeological, geophysical caveat at the very least put into place before any development takes place. So what Dr. O'Donovan was basically talking about, and the man knows what he's talking about because he worked in Srebrenica.
Yeah.
And the massacre that happened there in Bosnia in 1985, he worked there in 2005. Yeah. And he's clearly talked about the underrepresentation, the fact that there's so much ground disturbance that you mightn't even get all the answers because of the road construction in Bessborough, for example. Yeah. And that happened in Marionvale and Newry, and it'll happen for so many more years to come unless the government actually takes such action. We are not capable of keeping an eye on every single site in Ireland because there's literally hundreds of them.
No, and a national monument status would give it what exactly? I mean, in terms of legal protection from any development, well, what else? A guarantee that nothing will be developed here. I mean, I remember Wood Quay. We've talked about Wood Quay, the Viking settlement. At least they allowed them to excavate what they could from that site before building over it.
Yeah.
I mean, Isn't it just, Frank, onto you, just in terms of a coroner's report, isn't everybody entitled to a coroner's report? Isn't that a convention of human rights? Aren't we allowed to find out the cause of death?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the more I read about this, the more legally complex it appears, but it seems to me that there are mechanisms being deployed which are preventing rights rather than actually promoting those rights. And I think the starting point, there was an earlier article in the week which was quoting Dr. O'Donovan, and he actually said, and I think this is the starting point, that whether it's Bessborough or whether it's any other location, they should be preserved initially and treated as scenes of crime. Yeah. And, you know, I don't think somebody like Dr. O'Donovan would be making that kind of statement without, as Eunan has said, without, you know, extensive experience and understanding what the issues are in land like this. And I think the second most concerning thing was this bill that's going through the Oireachtas at the moment, sort of seeking to preclude any involvement by the coroners. I just don't understand that. Now that set off a train of thought in my head. I started to think of the International Convention on Enforced Disappearances, because you could make arguments certainly around that, but there's no retrospection in terms of that convention. And so therefore the opening, if you like, for victim survivors and their families has to come through the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, Article 6 gives us our primary rights to a right to a fair hearing, but a right to a fair hearing is not just about a hearing, it's also about the right to a fair investigation, a proper investigation. Now, if the state is minded to preclude the role of a coroner in whatever jurisdiction it's an inquisitive role. It's basically to determine what happened and how did that person die. Whereas it seems to me that the pressure is on just simply to take the bodies out from various burial sites and to reinter them somewhere else, as if somehow that is going to draw a line under the issue. I think that's only the beginning of the issue. And then I started to look at all the various burial acts and regulations going back as far as 1888, right up to 2013. And I found it was actually relevant to my own grandmother's case. Because even as far back as 1888, for example, people who died in Ireland had to be buried in a coffin or in a container that would obviously hold them. And it wasn't until 2013 that the law was amended in Ireland to allow for uncoffined burials. Now, I can tell you, I'm not completely au fait with Tuam and other places, but I can tell you, certainly as far as Hyde Park is concerned, many of the women were not coffined. They were uncoffined. They were buried in muslin. And there's quite a story about what happened to those women when they died. In fact, in the last week, I've been talking to somebody here in the UK who gave me some very vivid descriptions about what happens to women at the point of death. Now, when I'm looking at this set of proposals for Tuam and indeed other sites and the preclusion of the coroner, if I were certainly affected by, say, for example, the Tuam issue, I would want a coroner definitely involved, because it is my right as a family member. It's my right. It's my right under the European Convention on Human Rights to be able to do that. And in fact, under the Convention of Enforced Disappearances, there is a commentary about this retrospection issue. And the European Court of Human Rights has actually said whilst we don't necessarily deal with the actual subject matter of enforced disappearances, there are a number of other articles within the convention that could easily encapsulate that. But to determine whether those rights are engaged, in other words, that you can actually pursue those rights, you have to have the basic right of investigation.
Yeah.
Because without the investigation, the actual determination of whether your rights are being breached cannot be concluded until you know the result of investigation.
Yeah.
Now that seems to me to be fairly Janet and John stuff, and but when I'm watching the political play on this, I am really not sure what kind of legal expertise is guiding government ministers on this, because if I, as a relative amateur on this, can actually, plot a pathway, as it were, to the logic of the law, the logic of the rights that exist in law, and looking at the failures that have taken place, you can see automatically why there is great concern amongst the victims and survivors and their families. But then to have Dr. O'Donovan making his very sage comments, I think, if I were a politician, I'd certainly be pulling back from the introduction of this law and thinking very, very seriously about what's ahead, because I absolutely promise you, in the same way that they've dealt with the Mother and Baby Home Report and didn't extend the period and thereby opening up tranches of litigation, if they don't deal with this right, they're going to be open to more litigation and challenge in the courts.
Breda, concerning Tuam, are they concerned in terms of exhuming the bodies and discovering the cause of death? Do you think that they are worried about, I don't know, broken bones, that they'll discover that a lot of more malnutrition than we've suspected, aspects like that? Do you think that's...
I think right throughout, from the very beginning, the government had no will to actually go in with a coroner or to do what's right by survivors, families, and the lost children themselves and the lost mothers that are missing. And it's interesting that I looked back over, because oftentimes when you look at the political players, I was just looking at what people said in opposition, and it was interesting that Anne Rabbitte, for instance, took issue with the fact that there was no coroner, no mention of the coroner when Catherine Sapone had spoken. Of course, at that time, Anne Rabbitte was the shadow person for Fianna Fáil on the children's issues. So she was watching what Minister Sapone was saying and picking up on what was wrong with what she was saying. And what she was saying was, there isn't kind of reflecting that, a coroner, the need for a coroner did not need to be there. And that is part of the problem, I think, is that for leadership within government, there is a lack of honesty, there is a lack of accountability, and there always has been. And I feel for the families affected, because they've had some very bad weeks. And more recently, even in the past week, there have been signs erected in Tuam, which caused deep hurt to those who have.
I wasn't aware of that. Breda, what was that?
Yeah, signs were erected, John, about, well, they say it was carried on Liveline. There were 4 signs erected that held the apologies, one from the President of Ireland, one from the Bon Secours, one from the Archbishop Michael Neary, and another from the Irish State. And nobody knew who put them up. And when it came to notice, the family members of the lost children came in immediately and asked how could this happen and who had done it. And it appeared that a local group in Tuam took responsibility. They spoke on the Joe Duffy show. And Catherine Corliss had also spoken. Yeah, that's the sign, Bon Secours sister's statement. And Catherine said that 3 weeks previously she had been asked about it, and she felt it would generate discussion so that, it could be a good thing. Whereas for families, the words are absolutely empty. And below that ground that you see there, are the remains of, 796, and they do not include stillborn babies that may be there. And as regards coffined burials, which is what Frank said in the beginning, we have an idea. There were often contracts for coffins with Galway County Council. So in the early days, it is thought that perhaps the remains of children were then put into coffins. But certainly after a period of time, we have the evidence from those who fell into the area, like Mary Moriarty. She fell down into it, and she saw that, again, like Frank says, they were covered with cloth, a type of muslin or whatever, and done in little bundles, as she called them, and laid there one on top of the other, so that as the body would decompose, the remains would fall away, the bones would fall away, and they would intermingle, which was one of the reasons that the minister, that they had said in the beginning, was, it would be impossible to put these remains together. But other experts, such as Professor Sue Black, they have done all of this.
Yeah.
So it's not absolutely impossible. We've spent 11.5 million on a report that is from a government perspective. Why can't we spend 11.5 million getting the best expertise that there is in the world and doing what is right by the little children who were lost, by their families, by their mothers, and by society? Because if we don't do this, we're kicking that can down the road. And right now, like Frank says, the burials legislation, what they're doing right now is looking again to us to explain why we need a coroner or why we need to have a forensic investigation on a site where there are human remains. In Galway, when human remains were found in an archaeological site on Eyre Square, there was no hesitancy in shutting that site down and getting the coroner in.
Right, and surrounding it with tape and everything, and all the tents and all that sort of stuff. Isn't the coroner legally obliged if there's a death in his jurisdiction or a body found, or isn't he obliged to hold an inquest?
It's to me, it would be it would introduce terrible conflict for any coroner. To, on the one hand, to be guided by a law that sets out his or her duties as a coroner and their responsibility, as you quite correctly say, to investigate a death in their locality. It doesn't matter how long the person has died, that is their primary responsibility. But then to introduce this demarcation, I cannot understand how they can actually introduce that and at the same time ignore the fundamental rights that exist, not just, shall we say, under the Constitution, but more importantly, under the European Convention on Human Rights. The primary right is the Article 6, the right to a fair hearing, as I say, which includes the right to an investigation. And the way that you secure that investigation is through police inquiries or indeed coronial inquiries. So there is no logic to the exclusion of this. The only logic that appears to be at play at this, well, perhaps two logics, is one, to get rid of it quickly, to get rid of the issue quickly, and two, to do it as cheaply as possible. This is a matter of public interest. It's a matter, it doesn't matter whether you're affected by industrial schools, mother and baby homes, or Magdalen laundries. It's a matter of public interest for every single Irish citizen. And for the life of me, I cannot understand the logic of government lawyers or ministers who appear willing to subscribe to this particular law. Does not make any sense.
Ewan, in the north, where you're from, the disappeared is a constant refrain against Sinn Féin and against it's used as it's weaponized, as Anne Rabbitte would say. This is far greater, on a greater scale and a more disturbing scale. It's like
yeah, absolutely, John. When Frank, for example, talks about enforced disappearances, unfortunately, it's always been confined to the conflict that we had for such a long period. And Of course, these enforced disappearances are an issue that the Republic of Ireland wants to stay well away from, because they know it permeates into all of the issues around the mother and baby institutions and the Magdalen laundries and the workhouses, and of course some of the other institutions as well. We can talk about the industrial schools, the reformatories, the orphanages all day long. There's no reason to think that any of these institutions and the way they were run, especially when they were run by some of the same religious orders and churches, etc., why would they be any different? We shouldn't make a distinction in a geographical location. At the end of the day, it's absolutely irrelevant. But there's so many complicated aspects to this, John. I would argue that there's no point in even trying to think about logic and thinking about reason, to think about negotiating with decent civil people here, either in terms of the government or the institutions who are all under scrutiny here. Because, time and time again, these people have shown that they're absolutely belligerent, intransigent, that they're absolutely going to do their very best to make sure that not just the human remains stay underground, but all of these issues stay underground and as dampened down as they possibly can. It's absolutely staggering, because the developers themselves, and Dr. O'Donovan referred to this as well, that to do the right thing here, that the developers themselves would need to be in a position where, and they absolutely don't want this to happen, particularly because of this reason, that if any remains are found on the base for a site, for example, that they have a responsibility to take care of the costs for any post-analysis and the investigations and the DNA where possible, and all of these things. So you can understand, I heard the rumours years ago, for example, that the contractors that came into Tuam in Galway were told that if they found anything, to make sure nobody knew about it, to cover it up, to get rid of it, to dispose of it. Under all circumstances, do your very best to make sure this doesn't go out. Yeah. We had the same issue in Marionvale and Newry, where basically heavy machinery come onto the land, cleared away as much as possible as they possibly could. And then we had an absolutely shameful and farcical investigation. So Dr. O'Donovan has also referred to the fact that even the Commission found that most of the infants that are likely buried in Bessborough are under 3 months old, which means that they are not formed the same as adults. They're not mineralized, they're not as strong, their bones and all are likely to disintegrate quicker, which means that they're in shallow graves. It'll be harder to get their DNA extractions. You might find the likes of nappy pins and buttons, but the very fact that there's been a road construction went through part of those grounds means that there's been an awful lot of ground disturbance, and that negates and mitigates against trying to find out the truth. But that doesn't mean that it's still not possible. So you have to do, this is all about due diligence. This is all about making sure the families, the relatives of all of these people, and that's very important, is to adhere to the wishes and respects of everybody related to anybody that might be under these grounds. And certainly in Bessborough, it seems the case that many of the families don't want the grounds disturbed at all, but they want to protect it, to make sure that nothing happens. And they have a right to that. We're talking about rights here. We have the right to a dignified burial, whether it's Christian, non-Christian, whatever the case may be. So again, the government has to do its very best to, in the interest of all of the citizens, living and dead, to make sure that they cover all bases here.
And a right to a fair hearing, as Frank says. How do you deal, though, Breda and Frank and how do you deal with people who are dealing with you in bad faith? I mean, you have Anne Rabbitte, who, when she was in opposition, she was calling for wondering where the coroner is, rightly, because she's a Galway TD. And then now she's a junior minister or whatever, and she's just laying into you guys, saying that survivors have been weaponized, completely not mentioning coroners or anything.
Well, I mean,
how do you deal when they're when you're dealing with people just in bad faith and you can't really trust them and they think the worst of you or your motives?
Do you know what? I have a different profile, I suspect, to a lot of the people involved in this. And my day job is I'm a consumer campaigner, and I work, politically campaigning on those issues. And the amount of times that I have had names and mud thrown at me, publicly and otherwise, I've lost count. Frankly, I don't pay any heed to any politician, be they Irish, English, or any other European politician, who throw these sort of brickbats around, because quite frankly, it tells me that they know they're losing the argument. They know they're losing the argument in decency and on facts alone. And so, there are many people who are very deeply affected by these words. It's all right for me to say, these are brickbats, and you get used to ignoring it. But when you haven't got the experience that I've got, it does hurt. I can remember when I first started doing the job I was doing, I wondered what the heck was going on. But you soon become toughened to it. But it is very, very difficult, I think, for victims and survivors and their families to cope with that. And I saw the after effect of that after the debacle in October last year about the archiving of the material from the Mother and Babies Home. And there were some pretty awful responses from certain TDs on Twitter, for heaven's sake. And there is an argument, that, the politicians or the lawyers you've got, or indeed the police you've got, are a reflection of the society that you live in. But, if you aspire to exist in these positions, you need to draw back. You need to actually look at the situation, look at the people you're dealing with, and show some respect. But equally, if you're in the business of politics, you need to understand the laws you're actually dealing with, or you are responsible for, and understand their interplay with the very people that you represent, or indeed that you don't represent. And to suggest that victims and survivors are being weaponized, who are weaponizing victims and survivors? Me? Breeder? Unan? Absolutely not. No way. This is just an aerosol phrase that is being used by politicians to divert attention. It's also being used by some journalists in the Republic as well. I've seen some of their writings as well. The issue here is, this is a serious matter of public interest that has been going on for decades. And if Ireland truly believes in the rule of law and the rule of human rights, then we need to put aside some of these childish ways, these childish expressions, and show some respect.
On that, Breda and Union, you were talking to Amnesty International, is that right, this week?
Yes, myself and Breda were involved in some webinars that Amnesty set up, and particularly to deal with lessons of the past, I suppose. So previous inquiries and commissions that have happened all around the world, Amnesty organised some seminars to get some victims and survivors, advocates, journalists and academics, and all together from Canada and Australia. These are still ongoing, by the way, because we've still another couple to go through. And basically, it's an information gathering exercise as to how we go forward with our co-design process, because we've really pretentiously, falsely, we don't know how much co-design authority and empowerment we're going to have in the North towards a statutory investigation. But we're doing our very best to try and get our arsenal of information together and substantiate as best we can the statutory investigation on how we frame that and build the architecture around it. So Amnesty have been doing that, and it's an ongoing issue, John. So Frank's alluded to so many different issues there that it's unfortunately, this is a really, really toxic environment that we're involved in, and some of that toxicity naturally comes in between the victims and survivors themselves, who, you know what I mean, there's a lot of discord, there's a lot of disagreement about how we go forward, what we agree on, the priorities, what sort of justices we want, and a lot of that's very, very natural. But the government and the institutions that we're up against do their very best to make sure they keep the fire stoked as best they can. And when you've got the likes of Anne Rabbitte and others, and there are many others, Frank rightly talked about journalists, academics, a lot of people wade into this here, legal professionals, a whole lot. And unfortunately, we have to fight too many battles that we shouldn't.
And the letter, Breda, from the Irish Council for Civil Liberties to the UN Special Rapporteur on Tortures, and he has a long title anyway, deals with what we're talking about. Were you impressed with that, Breda, at all?
I'm impressed with anything that supports a full investigation, if it's in Tuam or any of the other sites, and of protection of sites. Because what has happened is that when a burial takes place, and I often say that these children, particularly for Tuam, are the unburied dead. They were never afforded a dignified burial, and there was no ceremony for them. They were concealed even when they were being placed there. It's possibly late at night or behind the high walls. So I think with every burial at any time, or with any disposal of sets of remains, there is evidence. And Anne Enright wrote a wonderful article on that. And she said, the dead do not lie. They are mute in their repose. And what is there is pure evidence. And that's what the government needs to face. They need to go in there, not with the mini digger as they once did when they were doing, granted there is some gravel, the site has been infilled, backfilled, whatever you call that way of doing things. And there, it is compacted. But, there are men in all of these areas that are quite well able to go in and dig appropriately, and forensic archaeologists with little mini toothbrushes to protect each little piece of human remains that they find, and try and restore dignity for families as well. Because in the interim, you have families who've gone through decades, at least now for the last 7 years, maybe looking for their loved one from Tuam. We have them. We have siblings in our group. We have a man who's looking for his uncle. We have cousins who are looking for the lost cousins as well. So, what do you say to them when you say, well, look, we haven't got the funds to employ the coroners or to do this correctly? That's not good enough. As Frank says, we look to international best practice. We employ that. And if you asked the citizens of Ireland today as to how to do this, they would not begrudge 1 penny of their taxpayers' money going to. They do when it's for the government and those giving themselves pay rises and shoddy reports, because quite frankly the Commission's report to us is, there's only certain parts of it historical that are anyway worthy of keeping.
Yeah, and like Minister Sapone said she was going to get the special rapporteur, and that never happened. I mean, I don't hold out too much hope with the UN either. And ultimately, what can they do? They can embarrass the government, or they can.
Who's embarrassed the government at this point? That's what we always thought was a kind of trump card. You can embarrass the government, but to be honest, John, I don't think they're embarrassed by anything. No. I mean, this is on Al Jazeera, BBC News. French news, the United States are very, very interested. We have members in the United States. To me, it is such a sad reflection, and not on us, not on the Irish people, not on society. It is a reflection of the government that year after year and decade after decade, when it comes to victims and survivors of abuse within the institutions run primarily by religious orders, we haven't got to look at the mental home institutions as yet, psychiatric institutions. But we really need to look at that, because the mistakes we made then, back 50 years ago, we are making in direct provision in homelessness services today, and children are still impacted by that. So we do not learn. The state has time and again shunned people because of poverty. because of exclusion, because of where they find themselves. So I really think that,
And
we've limited chances and we need to grasp it whatever way. It's wonderful to have Frank because his knowledge is on the law is fantastic for us. And Ewan is one of the best and most informed adoptees and activists that I've known. And great to have your forum, John, because we don't get airplay because we speak the inconvenient truths to people.
Yeah, but it's, I mean, I think it is making a difference. It is making a huge difference in terms of, the people are on your side for sure. I mean, there is no doubt about that. In terms of what next, how's this weekend or this week looking? Do you have a lot on, Breda, Ewan, Frank, in terms of the mother and baby homes?
Well, I'm still looking away at councils because I see, and this is the prime example, the burial sites, all of them are within various jurisdictions around the country. And so every council has a responsibility. They all have sites which were sites of incarceration in the past or maybe are today. And so when the planning comes, it comes primarily to the council first. So they need to look carefully at what they're doing as well. And
what happened with Offaly Council? What happened with you, Breda, and Offaly Council?
Offaly Council, they had a motion. Claire Claffey had put it forward, and Sean O'Brien had spoken on it briefly. But then time ran out. It was 1 hour 55 minutes or so, and they said they couldn't go any further due to COVID. So I'm hoping that it comes before them again. I've tried to engage. I spoke to one of the councillors who told me he's leaving within the next 2 months, so that he will not be on board. But I think it's an awareness campaign they need, and you're kind of pointing the obvious to them, but at the same time, sometimes they close their ears to it and they do not want to. I'm not a victim survivor, but I have many who will speak to Offaly, well, I have 3 who will speak to Offaly Council. And I think they need to hear those stories directly. And then that makes a difference. It made a difference in all of the other councils because they understood they can reach out and they have a responsibility. And the government are saying this right now, that it's coming down the tracks, that when a person who has been in a mother and baby home comes to them for housing needs and they have a listing, that they should be afforded a better opportunity on that list to get housing. I would go further and say that there is no listing for these people who have been abused and neglected for so long. So we've made great strides in Galway, I have to say. We've not had one request turned down by Galway County Council,
Brilliant.
which is amazing.
And Dan Boyle, who's a columnist, who's a Green Party councillor, regarding the Besborough site, he said there's absolute, political unity down there. I don't know how strong they are, but against any development there. So there is.
I think there is, and I think a lot of it, John, is down to the manner in which Maureen Considine and her group have worked on that. They are wonderful advocates, and you really have to admire the level of detail and the submissions they've put through. Ewan knows Maureen as well, and I can't speak highly enough of her for the work she's done, really.
She's amazing. And Union this week, have you things coming up?
About trying to catch up on some of my studying, but myself and Frank and Breda are working on the background on a number of issues, trying to pull a lot of things together, and it's an ongoing thing, John. At the end of the day, you know what I mean. The fighting and the battles we have to do it's an ongoing daily 24/7, and it's absolutely relentless. That's why people like myself and Breda, Frank's come into the equation now, like some Maureen Considine, so many other activists. I mean, it's just the constant fighting you have to do. It just never goes away. And I certainly see in people like me, and all of us here see, that the government will do its very best to try and avoid the uncovering of all of these crimes against humanity here. And this is effectively what we're talking about here. So, when you think about the abuses that victims and survivors have been through in terms of the institutions, it's when the general public will start to see maybe bones or photographs of bones and human remains being pulled out of the ground, that they know the government then is going to face a massive, beyond measurement, what the public outrage and the outcry is going to be towards not only themselves, but the people who put these people in the ground.
Well,
Physically put these people in the ground. So you can imagine that, when we all sit in the house and we watch media footage of what goes on in Rwanda or Kosovo or Bosnia or anywhere else, or remembering back to the Holocaust and the mass graves of tens, 20s, hundreds and thousands of people put into the grounds. And even when you think of the coronavirus pandemic and the mass graves that have been built in various countries around the world, and the way people have been thrown into these mass graves without coffins, this is what the government and these institutions are absolutely dreading. And it suits them when they have entrepreneurs, developers, all of these people with money who want to wipe out and erase this aspect of our history. Because if you look around Ireland, the huge numbers of famine graveyards, for example, are all completely wiped out. There's businesses, commercial enterprises, there's hospitals, all sorts of things built completely on top of them. Even the hospitals that were once workhouses themselves have completely detached themselves from the graveyard and the memorials of anybody that died in the famine, which some of us would call the genocide, by the way. But it just shows you the utter disdain, disregard, and disrespect that there is now as we move forward in a society for the people that have died and the people that have no voices, the people that are crying from beyond the graves, for people like us to help them, to give them acknowledgement and recognition.
Thanks, Ewan. I think we'll leave it there if you don't mind. Myself and Breed actually discussed it before about when the archaeological report came out and they deleted or they covered up the photographs of the bones. But I was thinking, if we can get the originals of that, it would be extremely powerful. It would just like wasn't it catacombs of bones?
Absolutely.
Maybe it requires something like that. Ewan Duffy, thanks so much. Breda Murphy, great to see you again. And Frank Breheny, great pleasure to have you on again. And hopefully we'll see you all